With that said, we can dive into number one. And go ahead, Osama.
Yeah, was interesting because neither of us are Cowboys fans, so we wanted to try and address the most important issues or what if moments for the Cowboys. So I've always been fascinated by everything around Jimmy Johnson's arrival and Herschel Walker. It's just such a fleecing. The Herschel Walker trade, probably the largest player trade in the history of football. It was in the 1989 season. I want to get into a little bit of the backstory and what happened before the actual trade itself. So when Jimmy Johnson in 1987 won the national championship game with the University of Miami, they went undefeated and he was highly coveted. So knowing Jerry Jones, he wanted to get the big fish. So he got Jimmy Johnson. And when he came to the team, I mean, he inherited a mess. The days of Tom Landry and Roger Staubach and all that was kind of long gone. So he knew he had to work some magic. And he kind of looked at his roster and said, okay, I need value. I need to find a way to build through the draft, which is what he firmly believed would be the best way to move forward. So he actually first reached out to Al Davis to trade Michael Irvin to the Raiders at the time. But Al Davis actually said to Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson, don't trade him. He said, are you sure you want to do that? That's my Al Davis. He said, I'd be happy to trade for him, but you need to keep Michael Irvin. He could smell the end zone. So they decided Jimmy decided Herschel Walker was the only player of value on the team. He was convinced that if you could trade Herschel Walker and get a good deal, that they could build it through the draft. Any thoughts so far? You're a Raiders fan. You knew about that Michael Irvin bit, right?
So I actually didn't until I was doing the research for this pod. And it's funny. He's looks like a Raider. He plays like a Raider. He would have been a great fit. But Al Davis and Jerry Jones were boys for a long time. So I guess he wanted to do his friend a favor and not take the playmaker off his hands. So that was an interesting nugget.
Yeah, that's a good point. Off the field, he was nuts.
Yeah.
There were 4 teams interested in trading for Herschel Walker: the Vikings, the Browns, the Giants, and the Falcons. So being in the NFC, there's no way Jimmy was going to trade Herschel Walker to the Giants. They were already a good football team at that time under Bill Parcells. The Falcons didn't get him because they didn't believe they could re-sign him. So the bidding war was between the Browns and the Vikings. So the Browns actually made a pretty formal offer to the Cowboys that probably would have been fair comp, to be honest. There was 1 player, 2 future first-round picks, and 3 second-round picks. There's a competitive pick offer from the Browns. They thought Herschel Walker would take him to the next level, as the Vikings did, and Jimmy thought it was a fair offer, but he wanted more. So he used Cleveland's pitch as leverage to extract more from another team, and funny enough, it worked. He called Vikings GM Mike Lynn to tell him what Cleveland offered. He gave him a deadline, and Lynn one-upped it. He caved and blew Jimmy away by meeting this requirement of picks and players that would turn into a couple of Hall of Famers. But if the Vikings hadn't bettered the Browns offer, he was going to go to Cleveland, Herschel Walker. So in turn, the Cowboys would have gotten a lot less compensation, and the dynasty may not have been would have not have been born the same way. Or tell us about the picks. I thought that was super interesting, the sales magic that Jimmy Johnson worked here.
Yeah, he fleeced them so hard. I mean, it was so, like you said, this is the largest player trade in the history of the NFL. It winded up being a total of 18 players and draft picks. So this is how the compensation worked out. So Dallas ends up getting 4 players, 3 first-round picks, 3 second-round picks, 1 third-round pick, 1 sixth-round pick. So Dallas gets 4 players and 8 picks. And Minnesota, of course, gets Herschel Walker, 2 third-round picks, a 10th-round pick, And for some reason, San Diego got involved in the deal, and Minnesota got San Diego's 5th-round pick, and San Diego got a running back by the name of Darren Nelson, who nobody's heard of. So it was just, I mean, just looking at it, I mean, Minnesota originally thought that they got the better end of the deal because they got Herschel Walker. But what they didn't know is that Jimmy Johnson, so a lot of the picks that, and the players, I should say, that Jimmy got from them, they were all conditional. So if Dallas cuts this player that Minnesota sent across, it would become a pick. And Jimmy, being the wily, sneaky dude that he is, he took these players and had no intention of keeping them. So he either benched them or cut them so he could meet the conditions of getting the pick. So his goal was just to stockpile as many draft picks as possible. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, so you got that completely right. He didn't want these players from Minnesota on the team. He wanted those conditional picks. So if he released or traded any of the players before 1990, he'd get draft comp. So he did that. Nelson was actually traded to the Chargers because he refused to report to camp. So he got 2 late-round picks for him. He cut Stewart to receive the 2nd-round pick attached to him, and the rest were benched for Jimmy Johnson. So I have an interesting what-if scenario. Before I get into the details of why I think what Jimmy saw here with Herschel Walker, what else did you want to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, what I didn't understand is why Herschel Walker was so valued. I mean, I guess the year before he had a great year. He had 1,500 yards, 5 touchdowns. But the 2 years before that, I mean, he didn't play a full season. He had less than 1,000 yards. So maybe Minnesota was just banking on his natural progression after that. But I didn't quite understand why he was so. Maybe it was his legend in college and how great he was at Georgia. But yeah, I didn't understand how much compensation he was worth at this time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In the 3 seasons he was in Dallas, they were 17-35. So I mean, it's not Herschel Walker's fault, but it seems like Jimmy and the Cowboys knew he wasn't a player who could turn them into a Super Bowl team.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he had 4 100-yard games with the Vikings. Emmitt Smith, who they ended up getting later as a result of this, had 5 in his first 18 games. When he joined the Vikings, I mean, we know he wasn't great. He struggled when he was there. Before going there, they thought that he was on a path to becoming a huge star. But he didn't fit the Vikings scheme. He played 42 games. He only eclipsed 100 yards 4 times in 42 games. It was pretty shocking for a guy who seemed to be the next big thing, especially from the Vikings perspective. They gave away a huge haul. What did Alvin Gentry say when the Pelicans traded for Anthony Davis and gave away 1 million picks? Well, as a whole, folks, right? It's just a huge haul. In Emmitt Smith's first 18 games, he had more 100-yard rushing performances than Herschel Walker had in 3 years with the Vikings. He was very prolific. It was just a massive game changer.
Yeah, and I mean the Vikings were pretty good the few years before that, before they got Walker, and then they just started to fall apart after they traded for him because the cupboard was bare. They weren't able to restock their talent, and they sent all their picks to Dallas. And I think it's important to note some of the Hall of Famers that Dallas got with those picks. So I'll let you talk about that, but it's very impressive.
Yeah, they got Darren Woodson, Emmitt Smith, Russell Maryland. I mean, just a couple of players that ended up being a huge part of their success in the early to mid 90s. So a good point about the Vikings. They were solid the 3 years before they got Herschel Walker. They were 28-19, second in the NFC North every year. After trading for him, it was all downhill. They went 7-4 after the trade. And then they were just 6-10 and 8-8. The Cowboys, on the other hand, got way better after they traded Herschel Walker. Emmitt Smith was was such a game changer. Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, such a huge turnaround. They went 1-15 in 1989, 7-9 in 1990. Then they go 11-5, and they won 10 games each season from 91 to 96, winning through Super Bowls.
Basically, all on the back of that trade. So I think it's pretty clear what if they don't trade Herschel Walker for 100 picks, we don't get the Cowboys dynasty in the 90s.